the tongue arrived at the county courthouse in a glass jar filled with brine, labeled in careful script. Evidence in the matter of Commonwealth versus Celia, enslaved, August 1855. The clerk who logged it into the docket noted that the specimen measured 3 inches long, severed clean at the root, preserved well enough that the cut marks were still visible. Teeth marks, the examining physician would later testify. Human teeth, applied with enough force to shear through muscle and connective tissue in a single bite. The jar sat on a shelf in the evidence room for 6 weeks while the case moved through the court. Visitors to the clerk's office reported that you could smell the brine from 10 feet away, that the tongue had turned gray-white in its preserving fluid, that looking at it made you think about all the words that organ would never speak again. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the tongue itself. It was the fact that when Robert Newsom woke that July morning without it, he lived for another 17 days. Callaway County, Missouri, sat in the west-central part of the state where the prairie began its long roll toward Kansas territory. In 1850, it was border country in every sense. Geographically between North and South, legally between slave and free soil, morally between people who found the institution distasteful and people who built their prosperity on it. The county seat, Fulton, had been laid out 20 years earlier with wide streets and a brick courthouse that suggested ambitions toward permanence. By 1855, those ambitions had been partially realized. The town supported 3 churches, 2 hotels, a newspaper called the Missouri Telegraph, and enough lawyers to suggest that disputes were common and settlements rarely simple. Robert Newsom lived 7 miles south of Fulton on 800 acres he'd accumulated through marriage, inheritance, and shrewd purchases of foreclosed farmland. He was 60 years old in 1855, a widower since 1849, when his wife Sarah had died of complications from childbirth that also claimed their infant son. The loss had left Newsom with 4 living daughters, Virginia, 22, Mary, 18, and the twins Anna and Louisa, 15, and a household that required management he either couldn't or wouldn't provide himself. He went to the Callaway County Courthouse slave auction in June of 1850, carrying $200 in gold coin and instructions to his overseer to bid on a field hand for the summer wheat harvest. Instead, he purchased a girl named Celia. She was 14 years old. The bill of sale, recorded in the county ledger on June 23, 1850, described her as healthy, of good teeth, able-bodied. It noted no distinguishing marks, no family connections, no history beyond the fact that she'd been sold south from a failed estate in Kentucky. The price was $180, $20 less than Newsom had authorized for an adult male worker. He paid in cash and took possession immediately, walking her the 7 miles back to his farm on foot while he rode his horse alongside her. What happened during that walk was never recorded in any legal document, but it would be testified to 5 years later by multiple witnesses who had heard Celia herself describe it. Newsom raped her before they reached his property. He stopped at a creek crossing, told her to clean herself, and explained that she would be living in a cabin behind the main house where he would visit her as he saw fit. She was his property now, he said, and she would do as she was told or suffer the consequences. The economics were simple. For $180, Newsom had purchased a human being he could use for labor, for sexual gratification, or for breeding future slaves who would belong to him by law. Missouri was a slave state where ownership conferred absolute authority over the enslaved person's body, movement, and reproduction. There were laws, yes, restrictions on manumission, requirements for bills of sale, prohibitions on teaching slaves to read, But those laws existed to protect property rights, not to limit what an owner might do with his property in the privacy of his own land. Celia lived in that cabin for 5 years. No one knows what name she'd carried before enslavement, whether Celia was given by her first owner or chosen for herself, whether she had siblings or parents who grieved when she was sold. The archive is silent on those questions. What survived is colder. Property records, court testimony, newspaper accounts written by men who never asked her about anything except the night she bit off Robert Newsom's tongue and ended her own life in the process. The cabin measured 12 feet by 14 feet with a dirt floor and a stone fireplace that drew poorly, filling the single room with smoke whenever the wind shifted. Celia shared it with no one. Newsom's other enslaved workers, 5 adults and 2 children, lived in a separate structure near the tobacco barns, where they could be supervised by the overseer during planting and harvest seasons. The isolation was deliberate. By keeping Celia apart, Newsom ensured that his nighttime visits would go unremarked by witnesses who might carry gossip to Fulton, or worse, to his daughters in the main house. The main house was a 2-story frame structure painted white, visible from the cabin through a stand of black walnut trees. Virginia Newsom managed the household after her mother's death, directing the enslaved women who cooked and cleaned, maintaining the kitchen garden, ensuring her younger sisters received the limited education available to rural Missouri girls. She was courting a man named William Powell from a neighboring farm, and their wedding was planned for the autumn of 1855. Mary helped with the younger twins and spent her afternoons reading novels borrowed from the lending library in Fulton. The twins attended a subscription school 3 days a week and complained that their father was too strict about their social engagements. None of them, Virginia would later testify, knew what their father did in Celia's cabin after dark. This claim requires examination. The Newsom farm operated like most mid-sized Missouri properties of its era. Everyone knew where everyone else was, what they were doing, and why. The enslaved workers knew when Newsom left the main house after supper carrying a lantern. They knew he returned an hour or 2 later without it, leaving the light burning in Celia's cabin. They knew she washed her bedding more frequently than seemed necessary for a woman who did no field work and had no access to enough cloth to justify the wear. Virginia knew because she had to know. She managed the household stores, distributed rations, tracked which enslaved people were sick or pregnant or needed new clothing. She would have noticed that Celia received better rations than the field hands, that her cabin had a proper bed frame instead of a corn-shuck mattress on the floor, that her dress fabric came from the same bolt used for the Newsom daughters' everyday wear. These were not favors. They were the payments Newsom made to maintain the fiction that Celia was something other than what she was, a child he raped regularly for 5 years. By 1855, Celia had given birth to 2 children. The first, a boy, was born in March of 1851 when Celia was 15. The second, a girl, arrived in February of 1853. Both children were light-skinned enough that their parentage was obvious to anyone who looked. Missouri law held that children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status regardless of who the father was, which meant Newsom owned his own biological children. He hired them out as infant nurses to neighboring farms, collecting their wages for himself. The system worked because everyone benefited from pretending not to see it. The overseer, a man named Jefferson Jones, received steady employment and a percentage of the farm's profits. The enslaved workers understood that any complaint to authorities would result in their sale to harsher conditions further south. Virginia and her sisters maintained their social standing by avoiding knowledge that would force them to acknowledge their father's monstrosity. The ministers who preached every Sunday at Fulton's churches collected their tithes and spoke eloquently about Christian duty, while carefully avoiding any theology that might question slavery's foundation. The lawyers and judges who would later handle Celia's case earned fees from probate work and property transfers that depended on treating human beings as commodities. Only Celia paid the full cost. In the spring of 1855, a man named George began courting Celia. He was enslaved on a neighboring farm owned by a family named Jameson, and he had negotiated permission from both his owner and Newsom to visit Celia on Sunday afternoons, when the prohibition on Sabbath labor gave enslaved people a few hours of nominal freedom. George was in his mid-20s, a skilled carpenter who hired out his labor during slack seasons and had saved enough money that he talked about purchasing his freedom once he reached the sum his owner had agreed upon. He wanted to marry Celia. In the legal sense, marriage between enslaved people had no standing. Missouri law didn't recognize such unions as binding contracts. But in the social world of the enslaved community, marriages were formalized through jumping the broom ceremonies, recognized by ministers who served black congregations, honored by couples who understood that their vows meant something even if the state refused to acknowledge them. George asked Celia in April. She said yes, but explained that Newsom would have to grant permission and would have to stop his nighttime visits. George, with the dangerous optimism of a man who had been allowed to believe that hard work and deference could earn him a measure of autonomy, agreed to speak with Newsom. The conversation happened in early May. George later testified that he had approached Newsom in the tobacco barn, removed his hat, addressed him as master, and requested permission to marry Celia with the understanding that Newsom would respect the marriage bond. Newsom laughed. He told George that he could visit Celia on Sundays if he wanted, but that Newsom owned her and would continue to do with her as he pleased. If George didn't like those terms, he could stop visiting. George returned to Celia and relayed what Newsom had said. She asked him to wait, to give her time to speak with Newsom herself. George agreed, though it cost him something to wait. You could hear it in his testimony years later. The way he described counting the days, knowing what was happening in that cabin every time Newsom's lantern light appeared through the trees. Celia spoke to Newsom in late May. She asked him to stop. The exact words she used were never recorded, but the outcome was clear. Newsom refused. He told her she belonged to him, that she had no right to refuse him anything, that if she wanted to see George, she could do so knowing that nothing between her and Newsom would change. She asked Virginia for help. This detail emerged during the trial, buried in testimony from one of the other enslaved women who had overheard the conversation. Celia had gone to the main house, found Virginia in the kitchen, and explained, in whatever careful euphemistic language enslaved people used when speaking to white women about such matters, that Newsom was forcing himself on her, and she needed it to stop. Virginia told her to go back to her cabin. What would you do standing in Virginia's place? You're 22 years old, engaged to be married, managing a household in a society that tells you your father is the unquestioned master of his domain. You've spent 5 years not seeing what happens in that cabin after dark, because seeing it would require action, and action would shatter the comfortable fiction that holds your world together. A 14-year-old girl, 19 now, gaunt from repeated pregnancies, desperate enough to risk asking for help, tells you plainly that your father is raping her and she wants it to stop. Virginia chose the lie. She chose her wedding plans and her social standing and the inheritance she expected to receive when her father died. She sent Celia back to the cabin and said nothing to anyone. June passed. Celia was pregnant again by mid-month, her third pregnancy in 5 years. George stopped visiting. He couldn't bear to see her knowing what was being done to her, knowing he was powerless to stop it, knowing that any action he took would result in his sale or worse. The isolation was complete now. Newsom owned her body. Virginia refused to acknowledge what was happening. George had abandoned her. The other enslaved people on the farm kept their distance because proximity to Celia's suffering might draw attention to their own vulnerability. By late June, Celia had stopped eating. By early July, she had begun making a plan. The plan required 3 things: a weapon, an opportunity, and the willingness to accept that survival was no longer the goal. Celia had none of the first, limited control over the second, and by mid-July had achieved a cold clarity about the third. She was going to kill Robert Newsom. She was going to do it in a way that ensured he could never speak about what she'd done to him, never testify against her, never use his words to shape the story that would be told after. And she was going to die for it. But at least she would die having taken something from him that mattered. She chose the tongue because it was the organ he'd used to issue commands, to justify his assaults, to explain to George that ownership gave him rights no marriage could supersede. She would take his voice the way he'd taken her autonomy, her children, her 5 years. The opportunity arrived on the night of June 30th, 1855. Newsom followed his routine. Supper at 6 in the evening with his daughters. The meal served by one of the enslaved women from the main house. Conversation about Virginia's wedding plans, about whether the twins should be allowed to attend the Independence Day celebration in Fulton, about the price of tobacco and the likelihood of rain before the wheat harvest. Newsom ate methodically, drank 1 glass of whiskey afterward, then excused himself to check on the livestock before bed. This was the fiction everyone maintained, that Newsom spent his evenings walking his property, inspecting fences, ensuring the horses were properly stabled. His daughters retired upstairs. The enslaved woman who'd served supper cleaned the dishes and returned to the quarters. By 7:30, the main house was dark. Newsom lit his lantern and walked to Celia's cabin. She had spent the day preparing. There are no records of her internal state, no diary entries or letters, only the physical actions that could be reconstructed later from evidence and testimony. She had cleaned the cabin thoroughly, swept the dirt floor, arranged the meager furniture so that there was clear space between the door and the bed. She had built up the fire in the hearth despite the June heat, banking it with green wood that would produce smoke and make the air thick. She had positioned a clay water jug within reach of the bed, filled it that afternoon from the well, let it settle so that any sediment would sink to the bottom. When Newsom arrived, she was sitting on the bed. She didn't stand or acknowledge his entrance. He closed the door, set the lantern on the floor near the hearth, began removing his coat. He was speaking. Later testimony from the field hands who lived in the other cabin suggested that his voice carried on still nights, that they could hear the low rumble of him talking, though never the specific words. Celia said nothing. This was unusual enough that Newsom paused, coat halfway off, and asked if she was ill. She shook her head. He continued undressing, still talking, explaining something about the wheat harvest or perhaps chastising her for her sullenness. The specific content didn't matter. What mattered was that he was relaxed, distracted by his own voice, not perceiving any threat from a 19-year-old girl who weighed perhaps 90 pounds and had never shown resistance beyond the occasional request that he stop. He sat on the bed beside her, reached for her. She moved then, suddenly, shoving him backward so that he fell supine across the mattress, his head near the wall. Before he could react, She was on him, straddling his chest, her hand clamping over his mouth to muffle any outcry. Newsom was strong. He outweighed her by 80 pounds, had the leverage advantage, should have been able to throw her off easily. But Celia had surprise and desperation, and 5 years of intimate knowledge about how his body moved. She knew he was left-handed, knew his right shoulder had been injured in a farming accident years before, and had limited range of motion, knew he would try to grab her wrists with his left hand while pushing at her with his right. She bit him. Not the tongue. Not yet. First, she bit his left hand, the one reaching for her wrist, hard enough that he jerked it back reflexively. Then she grabbed the water jug with her right hand and brought it down on his head. The jug shattered. Newsom's skull didn't fracture. The later medical examination would note bruising but no break in the bone. But the impact dazed him enough that his struggles weakened. Celia reached into his mouth with her left hand, hooked her fingers behind his teeth, and pulled his jaw open. Newsom was making sounds now, choked grunts that might have been words if he'd had air and control. She leaned down, her face close to his, and bit into his tongue as far back as she could reach. The human jaw can generate 650 pounds of force per square inch. Celia had worked in fields before Newsom purchased her, had the muscle development in her neck and shoulders that came from years of physical labor. She bit down with everything she had, felt the tissue resist, then give way, tasted blood that flooded her mouth and his, felt him thrashing beneath her with renewed terror. She bit through, the tongue severed cleanly at a point roughly 3 inches from the tip, leaving the root intact, but removing the portion necessary for articulate speech. Newsom's scream was a wet gurgle. Celia spat the severed tongue onto the floor beside the bed, grabbed the largest shard of the broken water jug, and pressed the sharp edge against Newsom's throat. "You speak one word about this," she said quietly, her mouth still full of his blood, "and I'll finish it." She held the shard there for 10 seconds. 20. Long enough for Newsom to understand that she was serious, that the calculus had changed, that he was no longer the one with absolute power in this cabin. Then she climbed off him, picked up the severed tongue from where it had fallen, and wrapped it in a piece of cloth she'd prepared earlier. Newsom rolled off the bed, hands clutching his ruined mouth, blood pouring between his fingers. He staggered to the door, fumbled it open, stumbled out into the darkness. The lantern still burned on the cabin floor. Celia watched him go, then carefully collected the tongue, placed it in a small wooden box, and hid the box beneath the floorboards. She had 17 days before they came for her. Newsom made it as far as the main house before collapsing on the back porch. Virginia found him at dawn when she came down to start the kitchen fire. He was lying in a pool of blood that had dried black overnight, still breathing but unconscious, his face swollen grotesquely and his mouth an open wound that bled whenever he tried to swallow. She screamed. The sound brought the enslaved workers running from the quarters and her sisters tumbling down the stairs in their nightgowns. Someone sent for Dr. Archibald Martin, who lived 3 miles away and served as the closest thing Callaway County had to a trained physician. He arrived by 8 in the morning, examined Newsom, and immediately asked what had happened. Newsom couldn't answer. His tongue, or what remained of it, was so swollen that he couldn't form words, only wet clicking sounds that conveyed pain but no information. Virginia explained that she'd found him on the porch, that she had no idea how he'd been injured, that he'd gone out the previous evening to check on livestock as usual, and must have been attacked by someone or something. Dr. Martin cleaned the wound, applied carbolic acid to prevent infection, and noted in his medical log that the injury appeared to have been caused by a bite from a large animal or possibly a human being. The severing was too clean to be accidental. The force required suggested deliberate violence. He asked if Newsom had any enemies, anyone who might want to harm him. Virginia said no. Her father was well respected, had no conflicts with neighbors, no outstanding debts or disputes that would motivate assault. Dr. Martin accepted this, instructed her to keep the wound clean, and prescribed laudanum for the pain. He would return in 2 days to check for signs of infection. No one asked Celia. For 3 days, the farm operated in a state of suspended crisis. Newsom remained in bed, drifting in and out of laudanum-induced stupor, unable to communicate except through crude gestures. Virginia took over management of the property, directing the overseer about which fields needed attention, sending one of the enslaved children to Fulton to purchase additional medical supplies, maintaining the household routine as though nothing fundamental had changed. The enslaved workers understood immediately what had happened. They'd heard Celia speak before about Newsom's visits, knew she'd been pregnant again, knew George had stopped coming. When Newsom appeared at dawn with his mouth ruined and unable to speak, the conclusion was obvious. But they said nothing to Virginia or Dr. Martin or the overseer. They kept working, kept their eyes down, waited to see what Celia would do. Celia stayed in her cabin. She didn't emerge for meals, didn't appear in the yard where the other enslaved people gathered on Sunday afternoons, didn't respond when Virginia sent someone to check on her. On the 4th day, Virginia went to the cabin herself. She found Celia sitting on the bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. The cabin was immaculately clean. The broken water jug had been swept up, the bloodstains scrubbed from the floor, the bedding washed and hung to dry. The only unusual element was that the small wooden box that usually held Celia's few possessions, a comb, a piece of broken mirror, some buttons, was missing. "My father can't speak," Virginia said. "Dr. Martin says someone bit off his tongue. Do you know anything about that?" Celia looked at her. "No, ma'am. He hasn't left the main house in 4 days. Haven't seen you either." "Been feeling poorly, ma'am." Virginia studied her for a long moment. Later, she would testify that she'd suspected Celia was lying, but had no proof and didn't want to believe her father's condition was the result of something that had happened in this cabin. To believe that would mean acknowledging what her father had been doing here for 5 years. To believe that would mean she'd been complicit in Celia's torment by her deliberate not seeing. "You'll need to come up to the house," Virginia said finally. "We need help with the cooking until Father recovers. The other women can't manage it all." Celia nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She moved into the main house that afternoon. Virginia set her up in a small storage room off the kitchen, gave her access to the cooking hearth and root cellar, assigned her the task of preparing meals for Newsom that could be swallowed without chewing. Broths, soft eggs, cornmeal mush. Celia performed these duties with meticulous care, bringing the trays to Newsom's room 3 times a day, setting them on the bedside table without making eye contact, leaving before he could attempt any communication. Newsom watched her. Even through the laudanum haze and the constant pain, he understood what had happened. He knew Celia had bitten off his tongue. He knew she was now living under the same roof as his daughters, preparing his food, moving through his house with the knowledge that she'd crippled him, and he couldn't speak a word about it without revealing why she'd done it. He began writing notes. On July 8, 1855, Newsom handed Dr. Martin a piece of paper on which he'd scrawled, "Celia did this." Arrest her. Dr. Martin read the note, looked at Newsom's daughters assembled in the sick room, and asked Virginia if this was true. Virginia said she didn't know, that Celia claimed to know nothing about the injury, that there was no proof, that her father might be confused from the laudanum. He seems quite clear to me, Dr. Martin said. He turned to Mary, the 18-year-old daughter. Has Celia said anything to you? Shown any signs of guilt or distress? Mary shook her head. She's been quiet, but she's always quiet. Dr. Martin wrote a response on the back of Newsom's note. Need evidence before making accusations. What happened the night you were injured? Newsom took the paper, read it, and hesitated. To explain what happened meant admitting he'd gone to Celia's cabin alone after dark. It meant admitting why he went there regularly. It meant exposing to his daughters and to Dr. Martin, and eventually to the entire county, the thing everyone already knew but pretended not to see. He wrote, in her cabin, checking on her health, she attacked without provocation. The lie was transparent but functional. It gave Virginia and Dr. Martin permission to act on the accusation without confronting the truth beneath it. That afternoon, Virginia sent the overseer to Fulton with instructions to speak with the county sheriff about issuing a warrant for Celia's arrest. Sheriff William Snell rode out to the Newsom farm on July 9th. He was a practical man in his 50s who'd held the position for 12 years by understanding that his job was to maintain order, not to interrogate the social arrangements that kept property valuable and labor cheap. He listened to Virginia's explanation that her father had been attacked in Celia's cabin, that he'd written an accusation against her, that the family wanted her arrested and held for trial. Snell asked to see Celia. She was brought from the kitchen, still wearing the apron she'd been using to prepare the noon meal. Snell noted later that she showed no fear, no anger, no emotion at all. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her and waited for him to speak. Robert Newsom says you bit off his tongue, Snell said. Says you attacked him without cause on the night of June 30th. What do you say to that? It's true, Celia replied. The admission surprised him. Most enslaved people accused of violence against white owners denied everything, forced the prosecution to build a case through witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Celia's immediate confession removed any ambiguity, made the arrest procedural rather than investigative. Why'd you do it? Snell asked. Because he was raping me. Had been for 5 years. I asked him to stop. He wouldn't. Silence filled the room. Virginia made a small sound that might have been protest or might have been recognition of something she'd worked hard not to know. The overseer looked at the floor. Sheriff Snell cleared his throat. That's not a legal defense, he said finally. You're his property. He has rights to... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence in front of Newsom's daughters. It doesn't matter why you did it. The law's clear. You harmed your owner. That's a capital offense. I know, Celia said. Snell arrested her on the spot. He bound her hands with rope, placed her in his wagon, and drove back to Fulton, where the county jail occupied the basement of the courthouse. The jail consisted of 3 cells, each 8 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls and iron-barred doors. Celia was placed in the middle cell, given a bucket for waste and a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks, and told she would remain there until her trial. The trial was scheduled for October 12, 1855. Missouri law required that enslaved people accused of capital crimes be provided with defense counsel, tried before a jury, and given the same procedural protections as white defendants. Not because the law valued their lives, but because enslaved people represented significant financial investment. and their owners deserved due process before having that investment destroyed. The court appointed 2 attorneys to represent Celia, John Jameson and Isaac Hockaday, both young men with limited trial experience who saw the case as an opportunity to demonstrate their skill in a losing battle. They visited Celia in jail on July 15th. Jameson did most of the talking, explaining that they would argue self-defense, that she had acted to protect herself from Newsom's assaults, that no person, enslaved or free, should be required to submit to rape without the right to resist. "The jury won't accept that," Celia said quietly. "Missouri law says I'm property. Property can't defend itself from its owner. We'll argue that you're still a person under God's law, if not man's law," Hockaday said, "that there are limits to what an owner can demand." Celia looked at them with something that might have been pity. "You know that's not going to work. You know how this ends." They knew. Every person involved in the case knew. But the machinery of justice required certain motions, certain performances, certain rituals that would transform Celia's act of desperate resistance into a legal procedure with a predetermined outcome. Jameson and Hockaday spent the next 3 months building a defense they knew would fail. They interviewed witnesses, gathered depositions, researched precedents from other states where courts had wrestled with questions about enslaved people's right to self-defense against owner violence. They found very little. Most cases involved enslaved people who'd killed overseers or other white men who weren't their legal owners. And even those cases, almost universally, resulted in convictions and executions. They did find one potentially useful precedent from Virginia in 1832, Commonwealth v. Charity, in which an enslaved woman had killed a white man who'd been renting her labor from her owner and had been forcing her into sexual acts. The Virginia court had ruled that Charity had the right to defend herself because the man assaulting her was not her owner and therefore had no legal authority over her body. She was acquitted. But that precedent couldn't help Celia. Newsom was her owner. Under Missouri law, he had virtually unlimited authority over her person, including the right to require her to perform any labor or service he demanded. The fact that he was using her sexually was legally irrelevant. She belonged to him, and ownership conferred rights that trumped any personal autonomy she might claim. Jameson tried a different angle. He petitioned the court to call George as a witness, thinking that George's testimony about his attempt to marry Celia and Newsom's refusal might establish that Newsom was deliberately obstructing a legitimate relationship. The prosecution objected, arguing that George's testimony was irrelevant because enslaved people had no legal right to marry and therefore no protectable interest in romantic relationships. Judge William Augustus Hall sustained the objection. Hall was the presiding judge for Callaway County Circuit Court. He was 43 years old, a slaveholder himself, educated at Transylvania University in Kentucky, where he'd studied law under professors who taught that slavery was not only legal, but morally justified as a civilizing institution. He'd presided over dozens of cases involving enslaved defendants and had sentenced 3 to execution in the past decade. He was fair within the bounds of what fairness meant in Missouri in 1855. He ensured defendants had counsel, allowed defense attorneys to present evidence, instructed juries on the law, but he had no interest in using his courtroom to challenge the fundamental assumptions on which slavery rested. While the defense prepared, Robert Newsom was adapting to his injury. He'd regained enough strength to leave his bed by late July, though he remained in constant pain and could only swallow liquids and soft foods. The loss of his tongue meant he could no longer speak intelligibly, but he learned to write with increasing fluency and to communicate through gestures. More significantly, He'd become a public figure whose injury served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of showing lenience toward enslaved people. The Missouri Telegraph published an article on August 3rd titled, "Savage Attack on Respected Farmer." The article described Newsom as a victim of unprovoked violence, made no mention of why Celia had been in a cabin separate from the other enslaved workers, and quoted unnamed neighbors as saying that Newsom had been too soft in his management of his property and had paid the price for his kindness. The article concluded, "Let this be a lesson to all who would allow familiar relations between master and slave. Such familiarity breeds contempt and, in this case, has resulted in terrible injury to an innocent man." The coded language, "familiar relations," told readers exactly what had been happening, while allowing them to avoid stating it plainly. Everyone in Callaway County understood what Newsom had been doing to Celia. Everyone also understood that acknowledging it directly would require them to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the system they depended on for economic prosperity and social order required the routine sexual exploitation of enslaved women, and that this exploitation was so fundamental to the institution that it could not be condemned without condemning slavery itself. So they spoke in euphemisms: familiar relations, intimacy, improper conduct, and they blamed Celia for resisting the violence done to her. On September 25, 1855, Jefferson Jones, the overseer, was clearing brush from a drainage ditch when he uncovered a small wooden box buried approximately 18 inches deep in soft soil behind Celia's abandoned cabin. He opened it and found the severed tongue preserved in brine, along with a piece of paper on which Celia had written in careful script, "This is Robert Newsom's tongue. He used it to say he owned me. I took it so he can't say that anymore." Jones brought the box to Sheriff Snell, who brought it to Judge Hall, who admitted it into evidence as Exhibit A in Commonwealth versus Celia. The tongue was transferred to a glass jar for better preservation, and the note was filed with the case documents. Both would be presented at trial as proof of premeditation and deliberate malice. The note was significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that Celia could read and write, skills that were illegal for enslaved people to possess in Missouri. Teaching enslaved people literacy was a crime punishable by fine and imprisonment, precisely because literate enslaved people were harder to control and more likely to forge passes, read abolitionist materials, or document their own experiences in ways that challenged pro-slavery narratives. Second, the note's phrasing, "He used it to say he owned me," revealed Celia's understanding that ownership itself was the crime. Not just Newsom's sexual assaults, but the entire legal framework that allowed him to claim possession of another human being. This was dangerous thinking, the kind that made nervous white people imagine slave rebellions and midnight murders and the collapse of the social order. Third, the preservation of the tongue in brine suggested planning and forethought. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of desperate resistance that spiraled out of control. Celia had prepared materials in advance, had thought through what she would do with the evidence, had hidden it where she believed it would never be found. The prosecution would use this to argue that she'd committed first-degree murder with malice aforethought, which carried a mandatory death sentence. Jameson and Hockaday filed a motion to suppress the tongue and the note, arguing that the evidence had been obtained through an illegal search. Jones had had no warrant to dig in the area behind Celia's cabin. Judge Hall denied the motion. Enslaved people had no Fourth Amendment protections. Their living spaces could be searched at will without warrant or probable cause. The defense tried another approach. They petitioned to have Celia examined by a physician to to document evidence of repeated sexual assault. Dr. Martin agreed to perform the examination on October 1st. He spent 20 minutes with Celia in her jail cell, emerged, and wrote in his report, "Evidence of multiple pregnancies and healed tearing consistent with forcible intercourse. Subject appears malnourished and shows signs of chronic stress. In my medical opinion, the physical findings support her claim of ongoing sexual assault." The prosecution moved to exclude the report, arguing that it was irrelevant to the question of whether Celia had unlawfully harmed her owner. Judge Hall agreed. The medical evidence would not be shown to the jury. By early October, the case had been stripped down to its essentials. The prosecution would prove that Celia had bitten off Newsom's tongue, and that she'd done so deliberately with intent to cause serious injury. The defense would argue that she'd acted in self-defense against sexual assault. The jury would be instructed that enslaved people had no legal right to resist their owners, and would convict her of assault with intent to maim. The judge would sentence her to death by hanging. All that remained was the performance. 1 week before trial, Celia requested permission to write a letter. Jameson brought her paper and ink, assuming she wanted to draft a statement for the court, or perhaps a final message to her children. Instead, she wrote to George. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. She apologized for asking him to wait, for believing Newsom might stop, for not being strong enough to protect herself without destroying any chance they might have had together. She told him that she'd hidden something for him under the floorboards of her cabin, the wooden box that had held her few possessions, which she'd buried separately from the box containing the tongue. Inside it was the money George had been saving to purchase his freedom, which he'd given to her for safekeeping months earlier. She wanted him to have it back, to use it to buy himself out of bondage, to build the life they'd talked about even though she wouldn't be part of it. She signed the letter, "Celia, who loved you." George never received it. Sheriff Snell intercepted all outgoing correspondence from the jail, and he determined that Celia's letter constituted evidence of an ongoing relationship between 2 enslaved people, which might suggest conspiracy or assistance in her crime. He filed the letter with the case documents, where it remained sealed until 1897, when a county clerk cataloging old records found it and transcribed a copy before the original disintegrated from age. The trial began on October 12, 1855, under a sky heavy with rain that never quite fell. The Callaway County Courthouse courtroom was full by 8 in the morning. Every seat in the public gallery was taken, mostly by white men who'd come from farms and businesses across the county to witness what the Missouri Telegraph had advertised as the trial of the century. Enslaved people were not permitted inside the courtroom unless they were testifying, but they gathered on the courthouse lawn, waiting for word about what was happening to Celia. Judge Hall took the bench at 9. He was a thin man with iron-gray hair and a voice that carried authority without volume. He began by instructing the bailiff to bring the defendant into the courtroom, and Celia was led in wearing the same dress she'd had on when arrested. Now 3 months of wear had left it faded and torn at the hem. She was visibly pregnant, her belly swollen enough that several spectators murmured in surprise. The pregnancy was strategic. Under Missouri law, pregnant women could not be executed until after they'd given birth. If convicted, Celia would be held in jail until she delivered, then hanged within 30 days unless she could secure a pardon from the governor. The pregnancy bought her time, though time for what was unclear. Jameson and Hockaday had no realistic hope of overturning a conviction on appeal. The jury selection took 2 hours. 12 white men, all property owners, several of them slaveholders themselves. They were instructed that their duty was to determine whether Celia had unlawfully and with malice bitten off Robert Newsom's tongue, and if so, whether any justification existed under Missouri law for her action. They swore to render a fair verdict based on the evidence. The prosecution's case was brutally simple. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Prewitt, called only 3 witnesses. First, Dr. Martin, who testified about treating Newsom's injury and confirmed that the wound was consistent with a human bite. Second, Sheriff Snell, who testified about Celia's confession and the discovery of the tongue in brine. Third, Virginia Newsom, who testified that Celia had been living in a cabin on the property, that her father had gone to check on her health on the night of June 30th, and that he'd returned to the main house gravely injured. Prewitt entered the glass jar containing the tongue into evidence. He passed it to the jury, letting each man examine it. Several jurors recoiled. One asked to be excused and was denied. Prewitt then read aloud Celia's note. "This is Robert Newsom's tongue. He used it to say he owned me. I took it so he can't say that anymore." "That," Prewitt said, "is a confession of premeditated violence. The defendant didn't bite Mr. Newsom in the heat of passion. She planned this attack. She prepared materials to preserve the evidence. She buried it where she thought it would never be found. This was deliberate, calculated assault on a man whose only crime was caring for her welfare." The defense began at 2 p.m. Jameson called 4 witnesses. First, George, who testified about his attempt to court Celia and Newsom's refusal to stop assaulting her. Prewitt objected repeatedly, arguing that George's testimony was irrelevant. Judge Hall sustained most objections, but allowed George to state that he'd wanted to marry Celia, and that Newsom had prohibited it. Second, Jameson called one of the other enslaved women from the Newsom farm, a woman named Hannah who'd lived in the quarters and had overheard conversations between Celia and Newsom. Hannah testified that she'd heard Celia begging Newsom to stop visiting her cabin, heard Newsom refuse, heard Celia crying after his visits. Prewitt's cross-examination was withering. Did Hannah have direct knowledge of what happened inside the cabin? No. Was she basing her testimony on second-hand gossip? Yes. Did she understand that lying under oath to protect another enslaved person would result in her own prosecution? Yes. Third, Jameson tried to call Dr. Martin back to testify about his medical examination of Celia. Judge Hall ruled the testimony inadmissible before Dr. Martin could take the stand. Fourth, Jameson called Celia herself. This was risky. Enslaved defendants rarely testified in their own trials because cross-examination could destroy them. But Jameson had concluded that the jury needed to hear directly from her about what Newsom had done. Celia took the stand at 4 p.m. Jameson established that she was 19 years old, that she'd been purchased by Newsom in June of 1850, that she'd lived on his farm for 5 years. Then he asked about the night of June 30th. "Why did you bite Mr. Newsom?" Jameson asked. "Because he was raping me," Celia said. Her voice was steady. "He'd been raping me since the day he bought me. I was 14. I asked him to stop. He said I belonged to him, and he'd do what he wanted." "Did you plan to kill him?" "No. I planned to make him stop. I thought if I hurt him bad enough, he'd leave me alone." "Why did you bite his tongue specifically?" Celia looked directly at the jury. "Because he used his voice to justify what he was doing. He'd tell me it was his right, that the law said I was his property, that I had no choice but to submit. I wanted to take that away from him. I wanted him to know what it felt like to have someone take something you need." Prewitt's cross-examination focused on premeditation. He established that Celia had prepared brine in advance, had cleaned the cabin after the attack, had hidden the evidence where she believed it wouldn't be found. He got her to admit that she'd bitten Newsom with enough force to sever his tongue completely, that she'd threatened to kill him if he told anyone, that she'd felt no remorse. "You understand that Mr. Newsom owned you legally?" Prewitt asked. "Yes." "And that as your owner, he had authority over your person?" "That's what the law says." "And you chose to defy that law by attacking him?" "I chose to stop him from raping me." "You chose to assault your owner in violation of Missouri statute." Celia met his eyes. "I chose to be a person instead of property." The courtroom erupted. Judge Hall gavelled for order, and when the noise subsided, he dismissed the jury for the day. Closing arguments would be heard the following morning. Jameson's closing argument lasted 40 minutes. He argued that Celia had acted in self-defense, that no person, enslaved or free, could be expected to submit indefinitely to sexual assault, that the law recognized certain inalienable rights that superseded property claims. He cited the Declaration of Independence, quoted scripture about all people being created in God's image, and appealed to the jury's sense of basic human decency. "Gentlemen," he concluded, "you know what Robert Newsom was doing to this girl. You know she asked him to stop. You know he refused. And you know that when she finally defended herself, she did so not with lethal intent, but with the specific purpose of taking from him the ability to justify his violence. She didn't kill him. She didn't burn his house or poison his food or run away. She took his tongue so he couldn't speak the lie that he owned her. I ask you to find that she acted within her rights as a human being, regardless of her legal status." Prewitt's closing was half as long and twice as effective. He reminded the jury that Missouri law was clear. Enslaved people were property, and property could not lawfully resist its owner. He argued that allowing Celia to claim self-defense would undermine the entire institution of slavery, would give every enslaved person in the state permission to attack their owners whenever they felt mistreated. "If you acquit this defendant," Prewitt said, "you are declaring that slavery has no legal force. You are saying that an enslaved person's feelings about how they're treated matter more than their owner's property rights. You are opening the door to chaos and rebellion. The law is clear. Judge Hall will instruct you on what the law requires. I trust you will follow that law and convict." Judge Hall's jury instructions were delivered in a flat, emotionless voice. He explained that under Missouri statute, enslaved people had no right to resist their owners under any circumstances. Self-defense could only be claimed against persons who had no legal authority over the defendant. Since Newsom was Celia's legal owner, he had authority over her person, and she had no right to resist his commands or actions regardless of their nature. "You may personally disapprove of Mr. Newsom's conduct," Hall said. "You may find his treatment of the defendant morally objectionable. But your duty is not to judge his morality. Your duty is to determine whether the defendant unlawfully assaulted him in violation of Missouri law. If you find that she did, you must convict her of assault with intent to maim." The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty. Judge Hall scheduled sentencing for November 16th. Under Missouri law, assault with intent to maim carried a sentence of 5 to 20 years in prison for free defendants, but enslaved defendants convicted of violence against white people faced mandatory execution. The only question was the method: hanging or burning. Missouri had moved away from burning as too barbaric, so hanging was standard. Celia was returned to her cell. That night she went into labor. The child was born on October 14th, 1855, in Celia's jail cell with no medical assistance beyond what Sheriff Snell's wife could provide. The labor lasted 6 hours. The baby, a girl, was born alive but died within minutes. Celia hemorrhaged badly enough that Mrs. Snell thought she might die too. But by dawn, the bleeding had slowed, and Celia was conscious, though weak. Under Missouri law, the baby's death removed the pregnancy exemption. Celia could now be executed without delay. Jameson immediately filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that Judge Hall's jury instructions had been incorrect, that Missouri law should recognize self-defense even for enslaved defendants when the violence used against them exceeded the bounds of reasonable discipline. Judge Hall denied the motion on November 3rd. Jameson filed an appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court, arguing that the case raised fundamental questions about the extent of an owner's authority over enslaved property and whether that authority could ever be limited by considerations of human dignity. The appeal was a long shot. The Missouri Supreme Court had consistently upheld slavery's legal framework in every previous case, but it was the only option remaining. The Supreme Court scheduled oral arguments for January 1856. In the meantime, Celia would remain in jail awaiting execution. Robert Newsom died on November 7, 1855, from complications of his injury. The wound had never healed properly. Infections recurred despite Dr. Martin's treatments. Newsom had lost the ability to swallow solid food and had been slowly starving. The final infection spread to his brain, and he died in his bed with his daughters present. His death created a legal complication. Under Missouri law, Celia was property of Newsom's estate, which meant she now belonged to his heirs, his 4 daughters. Virginia, as the eldest and executrix of the estate, had the authority to determine what happened to Celia. She could petition the court to drop the prosecution, could ask for clemency, could even manumit Celia if she chose. Virginia did nothing. She allowed the prosecution to continue, allowed the execution to proceed. When asked later by a journalist from the Missouri Telegraph why she hadn't intervened, she said only, "The law must be respected." What she meant was that acknowledging her father's crimes would require her to confront her own complicity. Better to let Celia die and maintain the fiction that Newsom had been the victim of unprovoked violence. Jameson met with Celia on November 20th to discuss the appeal. He explained that the Missouri Supreme Court was unlikely to overturn her conviction, that she should prepare herself for execution. Celia listened calmly, then asked if she could write another letter. Jameson brought her paper and ink. She wrote for an hour, filling 3 pages in her careful script. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, just titled, "The Truth About Robert Newsom and What He Did to Me." It detailed 5 years of systematic sexual assault, named specific dates and incidents, described the pregnancies and the children who'd been sold away, explained why she'd bitten off his tongue. "I want this published," she told Jameson. "I want people to know." Jameson read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll do what I can," he said. But they both knew no newspaper in Missouri would print an enslaved woman's account of her owner's sexual violence. Such an account threatened the foundational myth of slavery, that enslaved people were content in their bondage, that their owners were benevolent stewards, that the system worked for everyone's benefit. The letter was never published in Celia's lifetime. Jameson kept it among his personal papers, and it was found after his death in 1893 by his grandson, who donated it to the Missouri Historical Society. It wasn't publicly available until 1968, when a researcher studying enslaved women's resistance discovered it in the archives. The Missouri Supreme Court heard oral arguments on Commonwealth versus Celia on January 18, 1856. Jameson argued that Missouri law must recognize some limit to an owner's authority, that enslaved people retained their humanity even if the law treated them as property, that the right to resist rape was fundamental and could not be extinguished by legal classification. The prosecution argued that allowing such a defense would destroy slavery's legal coherence. If enslaved people could resist owners they deemed abusive, who would determine what constituted abuse? Would each enslaved person become judge of their own treatment? The system required absolute authority, or it couldn't function. The court deliberated for 3 weeks. On February 9, 1856, they issued a ruling. Conviction upheld. Defendant's appeal denied. The opinion, written by Justice William Scott, acknowledged that Newsom's conduct was morally reprehensible, but held that Missouri law gave owners broad discretion in managing their human property. The court could not create exceptions based on judicial sympathy without undermining the legislature's authority to define property rights. If the people of Missouri wanted to limit owners' sexual access to enslaved women, they needed to pass laws to that effect. Until then, courts were bound to enforce the law as written. Celia's execution was scheduled for February 21, 1856. In the 2 weeks before her death, several things happened. George petitioned his owner for permission to purchase his freedom, offering the money Celia had hidden for him. His owner agreed, and George became a free man on February 15th. He left Missouri immediately, settling in Iowa where slavery was prohibited. Virginia Newsom married William Powell on February 12th in a ceremony at the Fulton Presbyterian Church. The wedding was small due to the family's mourning period, but it went forward as planned. Virginia wore black instead of white. The Missouri Telegraph published an editorial on February 18th titled, "The Wages of Rebellion." It argued that Celia's execution would serve as a necessary lesson to enslaved people throughout the state, that violence against owners would not be tolerated regardless of the circumstances. The editorial made no mention of why Celia had attacked Newsom. Jameson visited Celia on February 20th to ask if she had any final requests. She asked him to ensure that her letter, the 3-page account of Newsom's assaults, was preserved somewhere that it might eventually be read. Jameson promised he would protect it. "Do you have regrets?" Jameson asked. Celia thought about this. "I regret that I didn't kill him," she said finally. "If I'd killed him, at least he wouldn't have lived long enough to see me convicted. At least I wouldn't have given him that satisfaction." The hanging took place at dawn on February 21st, 1856, in the courtyard behind the Callaway County Courthouse. Approximately 50 people attended, though Missouri law prohibited public executions, and the event was supposed to be restricted to officials and witnesses. Sheriff Snell read the death warrant aloud. Celia was given an opportunity to make a final statement. She declined. She'd said everything she needed to say in her letter. Instead, she stood on the trap door with the noose around her neck and looked out at the assembled witnesses. White men, all of them, representatives of the system that had purchased her, used her, and was now killing her. And she smiled. The trapdoor opened at 6:07 in the morning. Celia died instantly, her neck breaking cleanly. Her body was left hanging for 30 minutes as required by law, then taken down and buried in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field outside Fulton. No headstone marked the location. No record noted where exactly in the field she was interred. The tongue in the glass jar was returned to the Newsom estate as property. Virginia inherited it along with the rest of her father's possessions. What she did with it is unknown. The story didn't end with Celia's death. Stories like hers never do. They persist in whispers, In courthouse records, in the coded language enslaved people used to pass warnings and encouragement to each other. Within weeks of the execution, variations of the tale were circulating through enslaved communities across Missouri and beyond. Some versions emphasized Celia's violence, warning that resistance led to death. Others focused on the fact that she'd silenced her rapist, that she'd taken from him the voice he'd used to justify his crimes. Still others noted that Robert Newsom had died from his injury, that in a sense Celia had succeeded even though she'd paid the ultimate price. The white community of Callaway County preferred to forget. By 1857, the Missouri Telegraph made no mention of the case when reporting on other trials. Virginia and William Powell moved to a farm in the next county, putting distance between themselves and the property where Celia had bitten off her father's tongue. The Newsom farm was sold in 1858 to a family from Kentucky who knew nothing of its history, but the courthouse records remained. The case file for Commonwealth versus Celia was preserved in the county clerk's office, and occasionally someone would find it while researching property transfers or genealogy. A court clerk in 1874 wrote a marginal note on one of the documents. "Strangest case I ever read. Girl bit off man's tongue. They hanged her for it. Don't know if that's justice or just law." The distinction mattered. Justice would have recognized that Celia acted in defense of her bodily autonomy against a man who'd been raping her since she was 14. Law recognized only that she'd damaged valuable property and had to be punished to maintain the system that treated human beings as commodities. George, living in Iowa under an assumed name, married in 1860 and had 3 children. He never spoke publicly about Celia, but his grandson, interviewed in 1938 as part of a federal writers' project, collecting oral histories from descendants of enslaved people, said that George kept a small wooden box on his mantle that contained something from Missouri that Grandpa said was precious, but he never showed us what. The box was buried with George when he died in 1896. Jameson practiced law in Missouri until his death in 1893. Among his papers, his family found not only Celia's letter, but also a personal journal in which he'd written extensively about the case. One entry, dated March 1856, read, "I have practiced law for 20 years and won most of my cases. But the only case that matters, the one where I argued that a human being had the right to resist rape, I lost. What does that say about our profession? What does it say about our civilization?" The Missouri Supreme Court's opinion in Commonwealth versus Celia was cited in legal briefs as late as 1862, always as precedent for the principle that enslaved people could not claim self-defense against their owners. Then, the Civil War arrived, and Missouri's peculiar legal status, a slave state that remained in the Union, created chaos in the courts. Slavery was abolished in Missouri by state constitutional amendment in January 1865, and cases like Celia's became legal curiosities, embarrassing reminders of a system the state was trying to move past. But in 1897, something unexpected happened. A law student at the University of Missouri named Margaret Thompson was researching cases involving women and violence for her thesis. She found the Commonwealth v. Celia file in the courthouse archives, read Celia's letter that Jameson's grandson had donated to the Historical Society, and wrote a journal article arguing that the case demonstrated the fundamental injustice of slavery and the ways legal systems could perpetuate atrocity through procedural neutrality. The article was published in the Missouri Law Review in 1898. It was the first time Celia's story was told in a publication that treated her as something other than a criminal. Thompson argued that Celia's act should be understood as justified resistance, that the law's failure to recognize her right to self-defense revealed slavery's moral bankruptcy, that cases like hers proved why legal formalism without ethical grounding led to monstrous outcomes. The article caused a minor controversy. Several Missouri lawyers wrote responses defending the state's legal system and arguing that judges in 1855 had no choice but to apply the law as written. Thompson replied that judges always have choices, that every legal decision reflects moral choices even when those choices are cloaked in procedural neutrality, that the Missouri Supreme Court could have found a way to recognize Celia's humanity if the justices had wanted to. The debate faded, but Thompson's article remained in law libraries as one of the few contemporary analyses of the case. When civil rights lawyers in the 1950s and 60s began excavating legal history to understand how American law had systematized racial oppression, they found Commonwealth v. Celia and recognized it as emblematic. A case where every procedural protection existed on paper, where the defendant had counsel and a trial and an appeal, but where the outcome was predetermined by a legal framework that treated black bodies as white property. The tongue in the glass jar disappeared sometime between 1856 and 1870. County records show that the evidence room was reorganized in 1869, and the jar was not among the items cataloged in the new inventory. Whether it was deliberately destroyed, lost in the chaos of the Civil War years, or simply discarded by a clerk who saw no reason to preserve it, is unknown. But the jar's absence became its own kind of presence. In 1968, when historians began serious research into Celia's case as part of broader efforts to document enslaved women's resistance, the missing tongue became a powerful symbol. It represented everything that slavery's legal architecture had tried to silence: the voices of the victimized, the evidence of systematic sexual violence, the truth about what bondage actually meant for black women whose bodies were treated as their owner's property in the most literal, invasive sense. Researchers found multiple documents related to the case. Jameson's papers at the Missouri Historical Society included not only Celia's letter, but also his trial notes, correspondence with Hockaday about defense strategy, and drafts of the appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court. The Callaway County Courthouse archives contained the full case file, including depositions from witnesses, Judge Hall's jury instructions, and the Supreme Court's opinion. The Missouri Telegraph had covered the trial extensively, and those newspaper accounts survived on microfilm. What researchers couldn't find was Celia's voice beyond the letter and her courtroom testimony. There were no diaries, no personal writings beyond that 3-page account of Newsom's assaults. Everything about her life before the age of 14 was lost. Her birth name, her family, her childhood, the circumstances that led to her being sold to Kentucky and then to Newsom, all of it was absent from the archive. This absence is characteristic of slavery's historical record. Enslaved people appear in documents as property, as legal problems, as objects of white people's decisions. Their inner lives, their relationships, their ways of understanding their own experiences, these things were rarely documented because the people who controlled literacy and record-keeping didn't consider them worth preserving. Historians working on Celia's case in the 1970s and 80s had to build her story from fragments. They cross-referenced property records to track when she was sold and to whom. They analyzed medical testimony to document the assaults. They examined Missouri's legal code to understand exactly what rights she did and didn't have. They interviewed descendants of Callaway County families to gather oral histories about how the case was remembered locally. What emerged was a portrait of systematic violence enabled by law, normalized by social custom and erased by deliberate forgetting. Celia's case wasn't unusual in its basic facts. Enslaved women were routinely raped by their owners throughout the South, and those assaults were so common as to be unremarkable. What made Celia's case unusual was that she fought back in a way that left undeniable evidence, and that her resistance forced the legal system to articulate publicly what it usually kept implicit: that enslaved women had no right to refuse sexual access, that owners' property rights superseded any claim to bodily autonomy, that the law existed to protect slaveholders' interests, not to limit their behavior. In 2005, a historian named Melton McLaurin published a book-length study of the case titled Celia, a Slave. The book drew on extensive archival research and placed Celia's story in the broader context of enslaved women's experiences and legal resistance. It became required reading in many university courses on slavery, gender, and legal history. In 2012, the Missouri legislature passed a resolution formally acknowledging that Celia had been wrongly convicted and executed, that her act of resistance was justified self-defense, and that Missouri's legal system had failed her by prioritizing property rights over human dignity. The resolution was symbolic. It couldn't undo her execution or compensate her descendants, who, if they exist, remain unknown. But it represented an official recognition of what had been done to her. In 2018, a group of law students and community activists in Fulton raised money to place a historical marker at the site of the former Callaway County Jail where Celia had been held. The marker reads, "Here stood the jail where Celia, an enslaved woman, was held before her execution in 1856 for defending herself against her owner's sexual assaults." Her story reminds us that legal systems can perpetuate injustice even while claiming procedural fairness. May her resistance not be forgotten. The marker was vandalized twice in its first year, torn down by people who objected to public acknowledgement of slavery's sexual violence, or who thought the marker was divisive. Each time it was replaced. It stands there now, a small plaque on a street corner in a town most people have never heard of, marking a place where a girl named Celia spent her final months waiting to be killed for refusing to be raped. The wooden box George kept on his mantle, the one his grandson said contained something precious from Missouri, was opened after the grandson's death in 1993. Inside was a piece of cloth with embroidery worked in, careful cross-stitch. "Celia, who loved you." The same words she'd written in the letter that was never delivered. George had managed to retrieve something of hers, some artifact that connected him to the woman he'd wanted to marry and couldn't protect. The embroidered cloth is now in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., displayed in the section on slavery and resistance. Visitors who pause to read its label learn Celia's story in abbreviated form. Enslaved at 14, raped for 5 years, fought back by biting off her rapist's tongue, executed at 19 for defending herself. Some visitors move past quickly, uncomfortable with the violence. Others linger, taking photographs, reading the extended text panels that provide historical context. A few ask docents whether the embroidered cloth is authentic or whether the whole story might be exaggerated. The docents explain patiently that the case is well documented, that the court records survived, that this isn't folklore or legend, but American history. In Callaway County, locals still occasionally report strange phenomena near the site of the old Newsom farm. Sounds of weeping at night, they say, or the smell of smoke when no fires are burning. These reports are probably nonsense, grief and guilt playing tricks on imagination. but they persist. Some stories refuse to stay buried, even when the people who lived them have been dead for 160 years. And in law school classrooms across the country, professors teaching about slavery's legal framework, about the ways procedural fairness can coexist with substantive injustice, about the relationship between law and morality, still assign Commonwealth v. Celia as required reading, still ask their students what they would have done in Jameson's place, in Judge Hall's place, in the jury's place, knowing what those men knew, bound by the law they were bound by, facing choices between professional duty and human decency. The tongue in the jar is gone, but Celia's voice persists. Not in the words Robert Newsom spoke with his stolen tongue, but in her letter, in the court transcript, in the embroidered cloth, in the historical marker, in every retelling of her story that refuses to let the archive's silence have the final word. People still ask, was it worth it? Did her resistance accomplish anything beyond getting her killed? The question misses the point. Celia wasn't making a cost-benefit calculation. She was claiming her humanity in the only way left to her, by taking from her rapist the ability to speak the lie that he owned her. Whether it was worth it is a question only she could answer, and she's been dead for over a century and a half. What we can say is this: she fought back, she made him bleed, she silenced him, and then she walked to her execution with a smile, having taken something he could never get back, having proven to herself and to everyone watching that even a person the law treated as property could still choose how her story ended. That choice cost her everything. It always does. But some prices are worth paying, and some silences are louder than screams. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.